Hello, I'm Amelia Lidra-Wan, and I'll be presenting my paper with Danielle Wood. Do you collect data to give to the university, or do you do the work to benefit people, Indigenous data sovereignty, and environmental contexts? And first, I'd like to thank the Penobscot Nation and Philip Deloria for their continual research support and various funding sources at MIT, including the SHAS Undergrad Fund and the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium and Eloranta Summer Undergraduate Research Fellowship for helping support this work. And to begin, I want to establish the motivation for this work. We know Indigenous peoples are responsible for protecting much of the world's biodiversity. And we also know that protecting their lands has incalculable spiritual and traditional benefits. And we also know that Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of climate change and are experiencing its worst effects already, such as Indigenous peoples in Alaska. And to start this, so we understand that Indigenous data sovereignty is a necessary environmental context. And this Indigenous data sovereignty flows from inherent rights that Indigenous peoples have had since time immemorial that were formalized into the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007. So in particular, Article 31 gives Indigenous peoples the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as manifestations of their science, technologies, and cultures. And from Article 31, this definitions of Indigenous data sovereignty often come. So a very simple definition that I like is from the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, which defines Indigenous data sovereignty as the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. And this derives from the tribe's inherent right to govern their peoples, lands, and resources. So from this, we see that Indigenous data sovereignty is deeply rooted in the environment. Indigenous peoples' rights to their lands and resources. So we really wanted to look at Indigenous data sovereignty in environmental contexts and Indigenous data sovereignty, but we found that many of the foundational texts, such as these two books, don't directly address the environment, even though the environment is central to the definition of Indigenous data sovereignty. And Indigenous data sovereignty in practice, it has the CARE principles, which were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance that does a lot of grassroots work on implementing Indigenous data sovereignty. And in the CARE principles, there is collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And these circle around the idea of doing data to collectively benefit Indigenous peoples and rooted in their traditional authority and control practices, and that there is a responsibility for data to uphold Indigenous self-determination, and that there's an ethics for data to minimize harm and maximize benefits. And these are further broken up into other sub-principles as well that you can see here that were used in the analysis. Also, we see that there is some research on Indigenous data sovereignty in environmental research and governance, but that the literature is not fully fleshed out and could use more research. So some principles that we really took were from this paper by Williamson, Provost, and Price that iterates that educational opportunities should be offered to Indigenous groups so that they're aware of their inherent data rights, and that settler governments and research institutions should formally endorse the CARE principles, and that there should be clear data agreements between Indigenous groups and settler organizations when research is done. And these are three principles that we really pulled from in our research. And in our research, we did interviews with current practitioners to understand how Indigenous data sovereignty is being used by people already. And then we also conducted a case study with the Penobscot Nation to understand as researchers how we might use the CARE principles in practice. So for our interviews, we did semi-structured interviews based upon the CARE principles, and we compensated participants with $50 either via donations or gift card, and that we took this as a multiple descriptive case study approach. And we recruited participants based upon relationality. So we reached out to our network, including Megan Minoka Hill at Harvard Honoring Nations and Aaron Slater at MIT Solve. And we could not have done these interviews without Megan and Aaron. And so our three participants were Ava Burke, who runs Food from Fire and who's Danae Athabaskan from the Nenana Native Village, Shirley Williams, who is a member of the Lummi Nation and runs Swan Environmental, and then Alex Whiting, who is non-Indigenous but runs the Native Village of Kotzebue environmental program. And from these interviews, we tried doing a grounded theory approach, but we found that many themes did not emerge from such a small interview sample. But one thing that we found common across the interviews was the emphasis on community-grounded science communication, so making sure that products of research that done with community are applicable and used by community. For example, here we can see a poster version of stories from the lagoon. So understanding lagoons from near Kotzebue. And then using a deductive analysis approach, we analyzed the interviews using the CARE principles. And so we found that collective benefit is something that people already do, particularly Indigenous people doing work with their communities. They do their work for the benefit of their people, even if they don't call it collective benefit. In authority to control, we found that people were concerned with governance of data. So how people are accessing data is already a very developed theme. For example, Ava Burke didn't want, quote, any old Joe Blow from the internet looking at some of their information. However, we found decision-making, such as data governance, where data drives decisions, was not as developed and was a nascent theme. In responsibility, we found that participants are keenly aware of trying to explain capability and capacity in their communities and inserting Indigenous worldviews into their research. For example, Alex Whiting said that Western science with Indigenous knowledge can more closely describe what is happening in our world than just using one without the other. But often in the literature, responsibility is seen as a principle that is assigned to stakeholders. In the ethics part, we found that participants describe past negative experiences with researchers, and that ethics is primarily, again, a stakeholder responsibility. So those coming from outside the community to do research. For our case study, we worked with the Penobscot Nation, which is a nation located in what is now called Maine, which is shown by the red outline on the left. And in particular, they're located in central Maine, which is denoted by the blue dot on the map in the middle. We did some forestry analysis with them on some of the land that they currently hold, so this includes both feedlands and trust lands, which you can see, which they currently have, which are located along the Penobscot River watershed, which is their traditional homelands. And this is a map of the current tribal lands. In particular, we were using Landsat data to measure normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI, to assist in identifying areas for timber stand improvement. So this is done using satellite data and is remote sensing. And this is an example of the analysis we produced. So looking at NDVI between 2009 and 2019 and the difference. So this image is taken from Grindstone, Maine. And for this, we were primarily looking at, and to analyze our experience, we're going to use the CARE principles to show examples of where the CARE principles may not necessarily fully align with what is happening in practice and research right now. For example, here for collective benefit, we found there might be diverging interests based upon audience. We worked primarily with technical experts in the forestry division, which meant we did not have to consider more general tribal member interests, which may differ and have differed from technical experts' interests before one author found. In authority to control, we found that there are many questions regarding ownership and sovereignty over remote sensing data that is already open to the public and is conducted using satellites. We found for responsibility, there are questions of positionality for researchers and staff about who is responsible for what. For example, we worked with tribal government staff members who are not tribal members, but who are staff. So what does that mean for responsibility for engaging Indigenous language and worldviews in data analysis? In ethics, we found that thinking through data management at the beginning would have been a better step, but we did find that an iterative approach to data analysis and checking in with Indigenous partners, as proposed by Robinson et al., was very important and helped produce better results. So our overall findings was that collective benefit is already embraced and considered by all of the people we spoke to and worked with. Indigenous peoples do things for their community, and that's a part of their worldview and cultural practices. But it is important to name collective benefit in the CARE principles to make that obvious and more understandable to outside stakeholders and researchers. We found that formalized authority control is something to think through at the beginning and must be talked through and thought about both by stakeholders and rights holders. So rights holders are the tribes themselves. Responsibility and ethics are things that should be considered by stakeholders early in the research process before engaging in data collection, data analysis, and it's something that must be integrated throughout the research process. We also found that that domain-specific guidelines, such as those that I mentioned earlier in environmental research, are needed because things like the CARE principles, while broad, are very good for a broad-based understanding of Indigenous data sovereignty, don't necessarily match one-to-one when doing more domain-specific research, such as environmental research. So in conclusion, we call on all HCI researchers working with Indigenous communities to adopt the CARE principles, and that we would love to see more environmental case studies working with tribes to understand how the CARE principles actually translate into practice and how we can have more formalized best practices and guidelines for subdomain areas such as environmental research. Thank you.